So the 096 is designed, that cabinet is designed to not need any internal bracing. That's one of the differences also between the 096 cabinet and the 093 cabinet. 093 cabinet has some internal bracing and stuff like that because it's not an ideal cabinet. It was designed to be more affordable. This is more like the 096. There's no internal bracing in this cabinet because the materials, the thicknesses and resonance of the materials, and the panel dimensions are very carefully controlled so that we don't need any internal brace. So that's part of it.
And I guess just generally speaking, we're seeing DeVore trickle-down technology in these speakers.
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
Yeah, and you said as much about the tweeter being part of the OREF.
Yep.
And all that.
And also, Seos and me and we have a lot more experience and expertise with this cone material now that we've been making it for it's used in the 096, 093, OREF, the new drivers for the 20, and the production version of that use that same paper. So we have a lot more experience with that material, and so we've been able to make these drivers. I think our success rate with these drivers is because of that, because of our experience with it.
The 20? What's that?
The 20 is so our 20th. This year is our 20th anniversary, DeVore Fidelity's 20th anniversary, and so we made an anniversary speaker. Only 20 pairs, completely. They're custom made. Each speaker will be custom built to the customer's spec with exotic veneers and those kinds of things. Little numbered badges on each one, and the speaker itself is a trickle down from the OREF. It uses the OREF tweeter, and it uses a sort of a hybrid of the OREF woofer mixed with the 096 woofer. And that was the other project. Those came out. Those were designed this year as well. So it's been a very busy year for DeVore Fidelity.
This spurt of growth, because I remember for years I used to think, and I may have mentioned a couple of times, when are you going to make some bookshelf speakers? And all of a sudden you have all this stuff, including this amp. Was it COVID and time just to think about things?
Partly, yeah. Well, we've always made a Gibbon bookshelf speaker. We made the original Gibbon 3. We made the Gibbon 3XL. The Gibbon 3XL was discontinued a little before COVID. Yeah, COVID got, we essentially had to shut down in New York City. We shut down for a couple of months, and sales dropped. They basically went to zero for 2 months, little over 2 months. And so it got me thinking, I had to think really hard about what keeps the company going, to maybe diversify a little bit. That's what the Amplifier company, which is not the subject of this video, but that was a little bit of a diversification there. So the little shelf-mounted, the bookshelf speakers, that project, since I had built the ones for the office only just before our COVID shutdown, that was like a fresh project, and so I had a lot of time. That I started my YouTube channel because of COVID, and I just got to tinker with a lot of projects that probably wouldn't have gotten my attention before.
You told me you bought 50,000 of those tweeters.
1,000.
1,000.
50,000.
And then a few years ago, somebody told me that you had to buy a shitload of some other driver. Yeah. I remember being shocked at that. So that must take an awful lot of, you're a confirmed, brand in the marketplace, but to have to spend that much money must be, I would think it's scary as hell.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
And you're a family guy with a child and a mortgage and all that crap.
Yeah, no, running a small company is not, there's a lot of decisions that have to be made. There's a lot of things that I don't do that I can't release. People are like, why don't you release a speaker like the original Gibbon 3 for under $2,000? And it's just like, there's no way for a company my size. We build everything. Still, currently, we build everything by hand, individually. And at this point, with how much materials cost and everything, there's no way for us to do it. We would have to invest. First of all, we would have to probably get more floor space, because floor space in a Brooklyn, our rent in as a Brooklyn company is probably the equivalent of retail space in most other cities. What we're paying for our manufacturing overhead is I'm sure far higher than most companies have to pay. And so our footprint is very small. It's a pretty small space compared to what we produce here. And so there's a lot of constraints that we've got to work within. And for me to sign off on a big order of drivers, I have to be really sure. With the OREF Super Tweeter, that tweeter was fairly inexpensive. I knew obviously I was never going to use 1,000 of them in the O reference. Nobody's ever going to sell 500 pairs of O references, but I knew because it was inexpensive enough, and it was worth the risk because it was a sort of an essential part of that. It was an essential ingredient in that speaker. But the first time I ever had to buy woofers for the O96 before any Orangutan had ever gone to market, that was a huge risk. I had no idea how the Orangutan style speaker was going to be accepted in the market. And when they first started shipping, I got a ton of pushback from dealers. Dealers was like, "We'll never be able to sell a speaker that looks like that. Oh, that's so old-fashioned. My customers don't like speakers that sound like that." These are people that had never heard them. They look at them and they look old-fashioned. They just assume they're going to sound big and soft and
right.
And so I had to basically just be like, "Look, I'll give you a full refund. Just get these on the floor, get these demos." And within 6 months, it was our top-selling speaker, and it has been the number one selling speaker every year since it's been in production.
So what are the cubes called again?
Those are the micros. So it's MICR/O.
What are those selling for?
$39.50 a pair.
And how do you voice a speaker for sitting in a bookshelf with records? What are you listening for? How do you set the frequency and all that?
Well, so there's a few advantages and a few disadvantages to putting something in a shelf. When you put a speaker in like that, so that essentially the front of the speaker is flush with a flat surface, essentially you've mounted it in what's called an infinite baffle. What you're doing is you're taking a whole set of room reflections out of the equation. So in terms of how they're going to sound in a room, I have a lot more control over it. Every one of these that's mounted flush like that in a bookshelf or a record shelf is going to have, to a very, very large extent, they're going to have the exact same response in the room. When you have a speaker that's out in a room and is like a few feet out from the wall or really close to a wall or next to a table, all of those things influence the way that these are going to sound in the room to a very large extent. Those are not going to have any of those effects. The room effects are essentially taken out of the equation. So that's number one. Number two is, with a sealed box, essentially you don't get as deep a bass as you do with a ported enclosure, but you get a more gradual roll-off. So the roll-off, as the bass frequencies become lighter and lighter coming from the woofer, as less and less as it gets lower in frequency. But that curve as it rolls out is half of the steepness of the curve from this. So these they'll go lower in the bass and then they'll cut off really quickly. These won't go as low in the bass, but they cut off really kind of gradually. And so what I've done is I tried to tune that gradual roll off with where the reinforcement of this whole big wall will kind of boost it a little bit. Wow. So the in-room response, it still doesn't have the bass dynamics and kind of clarity that this has, but they've got sort of a big presence and a pretty warm full range tone.
What's the sensitivity on the micro?
The micro, so on the books, these are the same sensitivity, but in experience, they are absolutely not. Measured and reality are always a little different. So these are about 90 dB, and I would say you should consider these more like 88, 89 dB.
And what ohms are they running at?
8 ohms, very even 8 ohms across the board.
And why because Herb Reichert, who I listen to for all things, I'm always listening, says, sensitivity is not the last word in what it takes to drive a speaker. There's more to it. Sensitivity is more than it suggests. Can you expound on that?
Yeah. Sensitivity is an important part of the equation. Another, I would say, equally important part of it. So it depends a little bit on what kind of an amplifier do you want to connect them to. So if we're talking about Herb, we're talking about probably tube amplifiers. And if we're talking, and the most fragile, or not really fragile, but the most delicate and sensitive of tube amplifiers are single-ended tube amplifiers. A single-ended tube amplifier means it's a single tube or a bunch of tubes that it's doing both sides of the musical waveform. It's doing the positive and the negative waveform. It's like one device going up and down and up and down. A push-pull means it has a circuit on the positive and on the negative, and they hand off to each other. So the positive is going to do half of the waveform and the negative is going to do the other half. A single-ended circuit is by far, it's sort of more pure. You don't have the two sides, the positive and negative, are not handing off to one another, and so it's called a crossover distortion. That whole bit of distortion is taken out of the equation. You can't have crossover distortion with a single-ended amp.
Right.
The problem with a single-ended amp is you're limited to the amount of power that single tube or device has, and because it's single-ended, it has a much higher output impedance. A higher output impedance on the amp, it's getting technical, but basically it means that your speaker load is going to influence the amplifier more. So if the speaker load has really high impedance and then really low impedance and high impedance and low impedance, it's going to affect the actual frequency response of the tube amplifier, because they're much more connected. They're much more a part of a working, living circuit. So the 096s and 093s intentionally have very high impedances. They're up at 12 ohms and higher, which is not really ideal necessarily for some solid state amps, but it's perfect for those kinds of tube amplifiers. It lets those tube amplifiers be very linear. So you could have a pair of speakers that is 95, 96 dB sensitivity, but if it's 4 ohms or 2 ohms, it doesn't matter. That sensitivity is not going to matter, because those low-powered single-ended amps are never going to be able to drive it. It's too low in impedance. There's no way those tubes are really going to be able to push into a load like that. So the impedance is another part of it. The third part of it, in my opinion, is also it's not really a specific spec, but it's this idea that the speaker is part of the circuit of the amplifier. So a single-ended amp, or any kind of amplifier, if it doesn't have a speaker connected to it, or if it doesn't have a resistor joining the positive and negative outputs, it's not a circuit. It's open. It can't do anything. You turn it on and it's just going to overheat. It doesn't actually work. It's not a circuit until there's a speaker connected. So which means that the speaker is part of the circuit of that amplifier. It's joined in. And like I was saying, with the impedance and the sensitivity, what's going on in that circuit makes a difference in terms of how well that amplifier will be able to drive the speaker. So if the speaker is like a 5-way speaker with a lot of crossover stuff going on, what's called the back EMF, it's like the electromagnetic signal as it goes into the speaker and then back out into the amplifier, it becomes more complicated, and there's more push-pull variation. There's more stuff going on that's coming back into the amplifier, and the amplifier it's just harder for it to work. If an amplifier doesn't have a really low output impedance, it's going to be much more influenced by all that stuff going on in the speaker itself. And that's why all of the orangutans are 2-ways, or at most with the reference it's a 2-way with an added super tweeter on there. And that just it helps that amplifier be as linear and as good sounding as possible.
That was great.
That's a complicated explanation.
That was
but
great. That was like so much. There was so much in that response.
Thank you. Thanks.
That answered all these weird questions I've had floating around forever. In general, when you're working on new speakers, do you have, as a reviewer, I have like a bunch of go-to records that I use for certain things. You must have the same thing. So without naming records or titles, what music are you using to voice speakers in general?
Genre-wise, all of them, absolutely. Every genre for sure. And I have... So there's kind of there's levels of like work music, like music that I consider a tool. There's one level of tool music where very specifically I'm looking for evenness of bass response, for example. There's going to be a couple of tracks where it's only they're used for clarity, soundstage focus, things like that. There's a level that's gonna there's certain tracks that are gonna get me timbre and sort of correctness, making sure that overtones and ambient tiny information is glued to the source. A lot of times you can get a system and you can fine tune it and get it to be super detailed, but I find that a lot of times the detail is non-relevant to the instruments that are being played, and it stands out as detail and it can sound impressive, but it means, for me, it means that the design is not finished, and then the goal is to retain all of that detail but get it to be a part of the instrument. So for example, a cello, overtones of a cello, the timbre of the cello obviously has to have wood, it has to have rosined bow, it has to have strings, and all of the various noises and stuff that means. And you want to make sure that those noises, the rosined quality of a bow going across the string, or that woody resonance, we want to make sure that all of that is together. It's all coming from one instrument, and that can be tough. I mean, a lot of development goes on with all the models. It partly is getting that all to sort of communicate together. I'm going to pick up. We have a little visitor here. I hope nobody minds, but this is Lulubear. She's the longest employee I've ever had here at Dvoor Fidelity. This is Lulubear. So yeah, I have very specific tracks, cello included, but a lot of vocals for that last part of it. Also, just stuff like electric guitar. Certain recordings, at least, of electric guitar have a lot going on in them. There's the literal guitar sounds, the strings, fingers, picks, things like that. There's the sound of the guitar. Is it a Strat? Is it being played through a tube amplifier? And then there's the sounds of the amplifier. An electric guitar amp will always have self-generated noise. Sometimes it's a little bit of overdrive. They almost always have a little bit of a hum, like a buzz or a hum in the background. So it's actually a fairly complex sounding instrument. And so those are also things that I want to make sure that they're all coming from a unified source. Drums too, dynamics obviously for drums, upright bass and electric bass for things. So yes, there are. There's a lot of tracks that go through in the design process of the speakers, but they are sort of tiered. So there's some at the very beginning of the process when the speakers are nowhere near right. I get into the stuff that's really the stuff is more of a tool, and then gradually, as we get farther and farther into the process and the speakers get essentially better and better, closer and closer to being ready to be released, I bring in much wider variety of music, and it definitely becomes more enjoyable as well.
And as you're listening, are you changing what's in the crossover? Are you changing in your mind, how you're going to change the physical construction or treatment of the woofer? Are you changing the size of the box? I wouldn't think you can make
all those things. Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. So early on, we are designing the woofer. Yeah, we're designing the actual drivers. That's where all these prototypes come in. You have to get the driver right. So that entails designing boxes for those drivers, tailoring the boxes a little bit, obviously designing, getting the crossovers right. So it's all of these things are kind of in the mix together. You can't finish the design of the woofer without working on the design of the crossover and the other drivers in the system and the cabinet in the system. You can't finish the cabinet until you know what the woofer is going to be, right? You can't design the crossover. You can't finish the crossover until you know both of those other variables and things that happen in the crossover as you're getting closer to being finished will affect the tuning of those other devices. So, different iterations of the woofer will sort of happen over time as these other elements get closer and closer to being finished. So the box will change over time. The drivers will change over time, and the crossovers will change over time as we get closer and closer to being finished. It's not like, okay, this is the woofer I'm going to use, this is the tweeter I'm going to use, and this is the box I'm going to use. Now I got to make it work. It's never like that. It's, and that's part of my design process, and that's part of why it takes so long for a DeVore Fidelity speaker to come to market. Years. Literally it's a years long process, because so many times they go back to the drawing board, back to Seas. We need to, the drivers need to change this way, or this isn't working. We need to adjust this. We need to address the boundary layer between the woofer and the surround. It really is. I call it it's like a circular process. It's a circular process of prototyping, measuring and doing computer simulations, building new prototypes based on that, listening, and then repeating. And it just goes through that process over and over and over and over and over.
How many variations of box dimensions were there before you arrived at the O Baby size?
There were probably 6 different cubes. Remember, the cubes started the whole process. So yeah, probably 6 different cubes, and so I should back up a little bit. Initially, the O Baby was going to be a cube. It was going to be this. I didn't envision the affordable orangutan being this at all. It wasn't until I got the prototypes of this woofer and I started running simulations on it. So I do, we measure it, all that information, the measurements of the drivers go into the computer so that I can then play around and sort of get like a preliminary idea of how it's going to behave in a room with a crossover and with various types of boxes. And I realized pretty quickly that it was absolutely perfect for a miniature 096. Initially, I wasn't even designing for a ported box or anything, but when I ran a ported sim and I looked at the numbers, it was absolutely perfect to make a little mini 096. And so that was when I realized that these would sort of break off and become 2 products. And then this one became a less inexpensive O, and then this became the least inexpensive O.